Most men think they understand people, but they don't. They understand reactions, not intentions. They see smiles and assume kindness. They see interest and assume loyalty. They see attention and assume value. And that is exactly where the collapse begins. Because human behavior is never revealed in comfort. It is revealed under structure, under pressure, under boundaries. Machiavelli understood something most men never learn. People do not show you who they are when they are getting what they want. They show you who they are when you stop giving it so easily. And that is where the 60-second frame test begins. Not as a trick, not as manipulation, but as a mirror. A mirror that does not lie, soften, or negotiate. Because in less than a minute, a single moment of resistance will reveal whether someone respects your presence or only enjoys your compliance. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. There is a hidden pattern in almost every failed relationship, every confused situationship, every she-changed story men tell after the fact. The pattern is not mystery. It is permission. Permission given too early, too freely, too consistently. A man believes he is building connection, but what he is actually building is expectation. He answers instantly. He adjusts constantly. He explains everything. He bends small preferences into sacrifices. And he calls it being understanding. But understanding without boundaries is not strength. It is availability. And availability without structure always becomes exploitation, even when no one intends it consciously. Machiavelli would not call this romance. He would call it unmanaged access. Because once access is unmanaged, behavior becomes experimental. People begin to test what they can get away with, not because they are evil, but because all systems are shaped by feedback. The 60-second frame test is simple, almost offensively simple. You set a small boundary. Not a dramatic ultimatum, not emotional pressure, not control disguised as standards. Just a calm, reasonable line that protects your time, your energy, or your direction. Something like, I'm free at 6. If that doesn't work, we can do another day. Or, I don't do last-minute changes. Let's plan properly. Or even, that doesn't work for me. Then you stop talking. You don't explain. You don't defend. You don't add emotional cushioning to make it easier to accept. You just leave the statement in space like a finished sentence. And then you watch the next 60 seconds carefully. Not with anger, not with hope, but with attention. Because in that small window, something extremely important happens. A person either respects structure or reacts against it. A person either adjusts or pushes. A person either treats your boundary as information or treats it as resistance. And this difference is everything. A healthy, grounded individual will not feel threatened by structure. They may negotiate, they may communicate, but they do not turn a simple boundary into a psychological battle. But someone addicted to control, attention, or emotional leverage will react differently. They will soften the boundary with humor, pressure it with guilt, or destabilize it with emotional shifts designed to pull you back into compliance. Not always consciously, but predictably. And this is where most men lose themselves without even noticing. Because the real test is not the boundary itself. The real test is your reaction to their reaction. The moment you start explaining your boundary, you have already downgraded it. The moment you start defending it, you have already made it negotiable. The moment you start adjusting it under pressure, you have already taught the other person that persistence works. Machiavelli wrote about this principle indirectly when he described how authority dissolves, not through rebellion, but through repeated exceptions. Every exception becomes a precedent. Every precedent becomes expectation, and expectation becomes control. So the correct response is not aggression, it is repetition. Calm repetition. That doesn't work for me. If pushed again, yes, still doesn't work for me. And then you stop engaging. Because power is not in the volume of your explanation. It is in the consistency of your position. Anyone can say no once. Few can maintain it without emotional collapse when tested. And that is where respect is formed, not in agreement, but in stability. Now is the deeper layer most people miss. The frame test is not about exposing her. That mindset is emotional revenge dressed as intelligence. The real function of the test is calibration. It tells you what kind of dynamic you are stepping into before emotional investment distorts your judgment. Because attachment changes perception. What you tolerate in the beginning becomes what you suffer later. And what you excuse early becomes what defines the relationship later. So this 60-second window is not about judgment. It is about clarity before entanglement. Machiavelli would recognize this as the difference between knowing a person and negotiating with them. In negotiation, you are already invested. In observation, you are still free. Most men skip observation and jump straight into emotional investment, then spend months trying to fix patterns that were visible in the first week. But behavior does not become clearer over time. It becomes normalized over time. That is the danger, not deception, but adaptation. If a person lightly crosses your boundary and you laugh it off, you have trained them. If they test your time and you immediately rearrange your schedule, you have trained them. If they apply emotional pressure and you respond with over-explaining, you have trained them. And what you train becomes your reality. Not because they are manipulative, but because humans naturally follow the path of least resistance. If pressure works, they will apply pressure. If guilt works, they will use guilt. If persistence works, they will persist. That is not psychology, it is efficiency. The frame test interrupts that cycle early. It introduces structure before habits form. It creates a moment where behavior meets consequence instantly, without drama. And that is why it works in 60 seconds. Because people do not need time to reveal tendencies. They only need a small moment of resistance. The rest is confirmation. But there is another layer that must be understood, or the entire idea becomes dangerous. A man who uses boundaries to control others becomes just as unstable as the person he is trying to filter. That is not strength. That is insecurity in armor. Real frame is not about dominance. It is about non-negotiable self-consistency. You are not setting boundaries to force behavior. You are setting boundaries to maintain your own structure. The other person simply reveals whether they can exist inside it. And this is where emotional discipline becomes the real test. Because when someone reacts negatively to your boundary, your ego will want to correct their perception of you. Your instinct will be to soften the situation, to explain, to be liked again. But that instinct is exactly what destroys frame. Machiavelli would describe this as the moment a ruler becomes a servant, when approval becomes more important than structure. A man who needs to be understood by everyone will eventually lose his ability to lead his own life. Silence, in this context, becomes strategy. Not passive silence, but composed silence. the silence of completion, not uncertainty. You do not withdraw to punish. You withdraw because your position has already been stated. There is nothing left to prove. And in that silence, something shifts. People begin to feel the weight of your absence of reaction. Not because you are cold, but because you are stable. And stability is rare. In a world where most people are emotionally reactive, overexpressive, and constantly adjusting themselves for acceptance, stability feels like authority. It creates curiosity. It creates tension. It creates respect. Not because you are trying to create those things, but because you are no longer disrupting yourself to maintain comfort in others. Now bring this back to the core idea. The 60-second frame test is not about controlling others. It is about refusing to lose yourself in the early stages of interaction. It is about identifying whether the dynamic is built on mutual respect or emotional negotiation. And it is about making that distinction before attachment makes it impossible to leave cleanly. Because the most expensive mistakes in life are not made in ignorance. They are made in awareness that arrives too late. When you already care. When you already invested. When walking away becomes emotionally costly. That is why timing matters more than intensity. And that is why structure matters more than charm. A man without frame becomes adjustable. A man with frame becomes selective. And selection is where power actually begins. Not in controlling outcomes, but in refusing misaligned ones early. So the real question the frame test asks is not how will she react? The real question is, do I want a dynamic that reacts like this at all? Because what you accept in 60 seconds is often what you will negotiate for months. And once you understand that, you stop trying to win people. You start observing them. You stop explaining your value. You start protecting your time. And you stop confusing attention with alignment. Because attention is cheap. Reaction is instant. Interest is common, but respect for structure, that is rare. And anything rare will always reveal itself quickly if you know how to look. So the frame test is not a game. It is a lens. And once you use it, you stop entering situations blindly. You start seeing the early signals others ignore. You start recognizing patterns before they become problems. And most importantly, you stop building your life around people who only function well without boundaries. That is the real revelation Machiavelli would have pointed to. Not that people are good or bad, but that they are consistent when you are consistent. And the moment you understand that, you stop arguing with behavior. You start reading it. And what you read will always tell you more in 60 seconds than words will tell you in months.